Welcome to Automotive EV. My name is Peter Wooding and thank you for joining us. Today sees the beginning of our Automotive Outbound Series 2 and our first session today, or first session of this particular series. I'd like to welcome Justin Benson, who's partner of Vendigital, who will be delivering for us today our global automotive forecast. So it's good to see you again, Justin, and I'm looking forward to this. I'm sure everybody else is. So if it's okay with you, I will now hand over to you and stay here and just watching everything. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. And yes, okay. Thanks for setting the bar so high there. But we'll see what everyone else thinks when I'm finished. Let's. I'll just update. I'll bring up the presentation, and we'll get cracking. So that's me. So moving on, if we think about the global market, it's obviously a massive market for automotive. It is a truly global business, with obviously a lot of the key players based in the likes of US, China, and the Far East, and Germany, of course. So, but this reflects broadly where things have gone and where we think things are going to go, and it looks, reasonable in the sense of what's happened over the last 18 months or so with the pandemic, and how things have gone for the industry as a whole. The big change, though, and for those of you who have joined these presentations of mine in the past, it's all about electric, and I don't really make any apologies for spending a bit more time on the electric view, the view of electric vehicles and how they're progressing. After all, we are talking about automotive EV today, so I'm going to move into electric pretty quickly. But that's just a very high-level view of what the market looks like. How that breaks down by country and what's been going on, just illustrating a couple of slides now. China, as you can see, has only 2% down last year, has actually bounced back from the pandemic very quickly and very well. As you can see, South Korea actually increased over the last year, which is interesting because of their well-publicized approach to epidemics, and I guess their experience in that area has helped them prepare for this sort of thing in their markets, and so they've actually increased the number of vehicles they've sold in their market. As you can see, the rest of the world have been hit relatively hard, not least the UK, which I'm sure a lot of you will be aware of. But there are signs that things are starting to bounce back, but it has been a tough 18 months for all the automotive companies, but particularly in Europe and the US. Moving on, so going on to electric pretty quickly, these are the best-selling electric cars in those markets. The numbers aren't big. We're always talking from a relatively low base, but numbers are increasing fast, and I'll talk about that in a bit more in a moment. Tesla is doing well, as you can see, and as of last year, but you will see that that's changed just recently. But the Renault Zoe has been doing very well in Europe. And I do just make a note here, and I'll refer to it later, but it's interesting about the quality of the engineering in the Tesla. I've certainly become more aware of it recently in making comparisons between various electric vehicles at an engineering level, and Tesla's integrated model. And when they're looking at developing their batteries, their battery packs, their cooling systems, their management systems, it's an integrated approach to the way in which they provide the equipment within their vehicles, which makes the range more real. It makes the car perform in the way that it's intended. It helps the car perform in the way it's intended better. So the engineering of these vehicles is very interesting when you start to make comparisons, and I'll talk about it shortly again when we get into, I'm going to talk a little bit about batteries. But it's the big message for me here is that if you are engineering the product right at the right cost, you are going to sell electric vehicles in these markets. Sorry, moving on. So this, being a UK resident, I'm very much interested in the UK, and I think I'm going to go into Europe in a bit more detail, but as a kind of proxy for Europe, it's an interesting market because it sort of sits between Germany and France. And France and UK tend to vie for second position in Europe for sales. So it's quite interesting to look at the UK specifically. And as you can see, which I thought was really positive, is that overall vehicle registrations have overtaken last year as of April. The numbers just came out a couple of days ago, which I think is very interesting in the way that the market is starting to bounce back, at least in the UK, and there are signs that it's doing it in Europe as well. We're not quite near the 2019 numbers yet. We're still lagging behind, but I thought it was very encouraging in the way that at least the UK consumer is helping the economy in automotive bounce back. As you can see, overall sales were up 16% year to date on 2020. So that's good. And I'm referring here obviously to the red ellipse there as to my point. So now thinking about that from a BEV, purely battery electric, I will move around a little bit between battery and plug-in hybrids, but I'll explain why I'm doing that shortly. But this is purely battery electric vehicles in the UK, and as you can see, it's still roaring ahead. We had 186% increase over the whole of 2020, and even in the first quarter up to April this year, there's been a further 108% increase, and we're now seeing a consistently relatively high market share now of over 7%, which, when you consider the product and consider where it's going and the speed at which it's got there, that's I think that's symptomatic of what we're seeing globally as well as in the UK. You look to the top right there. I've just put some quick numbers in for the whole of Western Europe, just for a quick comparison. Overall, average-wise, we're doing better than Western Europe, but there's some interesting numbers in Germany as well, which are very similar to ours in the rate that they're growing. Slightly different reasons for that, which I'll come on to in a moment. Point being is that the march of fully battery electric vehicles is continuing at some pace. Now, looking now into a bit of forecasts and why things are developing in the way that we think. There's some of the stuff on the left-hand side. Some of you, I'm sure, will have seen that before, but it's an important message because regulation is driving a lot of the change. I do actually have some arguments with colleagues about this because they tend to suggest that the consumer is being a little bit forced into this. I would argue that the consumer actually is becoming much more aware of climate change, the effects of CO2 and the effects of global warming, and they see this as an important way of doing their own individual a bit, if you will, for the global warming issue. And so this is an important part of that thinking for the consumer, as well as it being very regulatory, both in the EU and in the UK. Notwithstanding all of that, of course, there are incentives out there, and France and Germany tend to lead the way and recently increased, well, this was towards the end of last year, but I think that's had a big effect on the numbers in Germany and France. They've been growing quite significantly, particularly in Germany with plug-in hybrids as well. It's meant that the electric vehicles are really, excuse the pun, motoring in Germany. The yellow graph there, I think, is really interesting because we're starting to get the feel and working with the data. I think we're getting a much better picture as to how things are going to pan out over the next decade. And for battery electric vehicles, it's quite something to think that between now and 2030, we could be at a level of about 55% mix. So this year, Europe should make between about 11.5, 12 million vehicles. based on past numbers. So the 8.5% mix this year in Western Europe, that's quite a big chunk of the marketplace for just purely battery electric vehicles. So quite exciting if you're in battery electric vehicles or you are supporting battery electric vehicle companies. Now, and the other big part of that mix will be, of course, plug-in hybrids, and particularly in Germany, the strategies of BMW and Mercedes, for example, are very much focused on plug-in hybrids. In order to get to that 1 gram per kilometre of CO2. The 95 grams per kilometre of CO2 level for their companies. So there are some different strategies here. Volkswagen is very much battery electric vehicle and is betting their house on that, moving much more towards fully battery electric vehicles. Whereas, if you like, BMW and Mercedes, and to a greater lesser extent JLR, are hedging their bets at the moment with their PHEV strategies. But I think PHEV is an important part of getting to the right answer in the future, so at least so far as emissions are concerned. I believe that they are a bridge to get there, and soon after 2030, and considering the technology advances and what's happening, in the next few years, will help move that mix more towards battery electric vehicles again post 2030. The PHEV part of the market is important because both in the European Union and in the UK, of course, there is this 2030 target to move to as low emissions as possible. And in the case of the UK, it's pretty much zero emissions for passenger vehicles. So let's see what happens. But I think that is reasonable. And it's actually taken into account that the global automotive industry is having to respond to some pretty tough targets over the next 5 to 10 years. So I'll move on now. This is some interesting information to back that up. These are the best performing, at least in sales wise, vehicles. Tesla, I think, as I alluded to earlier, has taken over from Renault Zoe as the top selling vehicle in Western Europe. And there are some coming up the lines. Hyundai, for example, is coming up. Volkswagen had a very good, well, I would argue a good second half last year after they finally launched the ID.3. It's having a mixed response in different markets, and it's coming into a market which is starting to fill up, and not least with Tesla vehicles. So cost and how you price these things and how you put them into the market using finance products or otherwise are really important in the mix, and how you start to increase your battery electric vehicle sales. But the one that really hit me hard, because I'm a bit of a fan of the car, is the Porsche Taycan. So if you compare it to the 911, the iconic Porsche sports car, they're actually selling nearly as many Taycans now as they are 911s. And I know it's a luxury vehicle, but that for me struck me as an interesting moment at least in Porsche's history, if not battery electric vehicle history. Because as you will be aware, in luxury, the new technology that goes into luxury vehicles starts to move its way down into the more sort of family vehicles as time progresses. So it'll be interesting how that technology works, because it's an incredible vehicle in the way that it operates, and how quickly it charges, and how quickly you can recharge it after a quick. If you put it this way, if you thrash it around a track, you can immediately charge it up again, and very quickly. You can't do that with other battery vehicles. So it's the technology they've deployed so quickly is clearly doing well in comparison to petrol vehicles. Moving on. I shared a similar one for the end of 2020, and again it comes back to the global view and how things are developing. As you can see, China really is the center for battery electric vehicles. That's the green part of that bar for China. But if you compare PHEV, but basically BEVs, battery electric vehicles, and plug-in hybrids in both countries, we're actually not far off. And if you consider that we don't quite have the population in Western Europe that China has, that suggests to me that the the take up and the move, the regulation is having a quicker effect on us than it is in China. But I think we still need to see what's going to happen to the plug-in hybrid vehicles as we go forward. I've shared similar graphs before. I guess this is just, it's all about data, but it just demonstrates what's happening in Germany. That's purely battery electric vehicles. And I go back to the incentives, and I think they're really bedding down now in Germany, and the change is really happening. As you can see as well, just a bit lower down, UK has taken over a little bit from France in the speed of take up. But these are nice. I like to share these ones because they're nice charts. As somebody who's in the battery electric vehicle market, you can see the growth, and at the moment it seems to continue. Norway, you'll be aware, is leveling off a little bit just because the size of the market, and they've been taking up battery electric vehicles for some time. But nevertheless, as an economic bloc, if you will, as the sort of UK and Europe, the take up it continues to increase. So that's a brief look at, and welcome any questions, but that's a brief look at what's going on around the world, and obviously specifically in Europe. And I've really focused on Europe because at the moment that's where the action is. If you think about the last few years, China, has really led the way, and of course America, the likes of Tesla and the West Coast, they've really led the way. As they've supported that in the sense of what they've been doing over there, but they haven't really seen the take up across the entire United States. But there is this move now, and if you like, Europe are catching up, and I don't say that lightly, because we are investing heavily in manufacture of electric vehicles, but also the supply chain, which I think is really important for us as a group. This is the current understanding of the number of European gigafactories that are in plan or under construction across Europe. There's 26 dots there, which are either battery, so cell manufacturing, or battery materials manufacturing, but all part of the supply chain. And it's an important part to think about that, because at the moment, with a lot of the existing vehicles that are built in Europe, a lot of the battery cells come from the Far East. So it's really important we start to build, if you like, domestic battery, our gigafactory assets, so that we can support this and the globe with the right numbers of batteries and technology for the future. I just draw your attention to the left-hand side. If you think about, I've only went up to 2030, but 2040 suggests that we might need half a terawatt hour to 1.7 per year, which is the equivalent to 45 to 95 gigafactories. This is just for European Union. I include UK for the purposes of the discussion. Which means that the number of dots on that map are probably going to grow. But it is relatively early in the supply chain, and there's a lot of investment going in manufacturing, and I think, and there's a lot of thought going into how the supply chain will work and operate. And one of the big messages for me in this is how the manufacturers, the OEMs, will be looking at this in the future. Because if you look at traditional supply chain, they tend to look at the tier ones in the main. So they're interested in what the tier ones are bringing to their factories, and then how they put the car together and then sell it on to the consumer. Traditionally, tier two has been known, but going to tier three, tier four in that supply chain has been a little bit more opaque, and has been a little bit more, and often sometimes when something happens further down that supply chain, it can have quite a large effect on what goes on at the factory for the car manufacturer. In this instance, I don't think you can get away from the fact is that you need to understand the supply chain to a lot more detail. You need to understand where your battery materials are coming from as much as you do where your battery cell is coming from. For me, this is all about chemistry. You've got to get the cell right for your design of vehicle, and that relies on the chemistry, and it relies on the types of materials, the cathodes and anodes that you're using in the battery. And it's quite a fascinating area to think of when we are moving elements from mines, which in Europe, moving them to areas where we create battery materials, which then go to companies that build the cell. There's a whole ecosystem going on there at the moment, and it's a big area for the European market, and it's very exciting. But nevertheless, it's also quite expensive to do all this, and so the regulatory, all the numbers I talked about earlier, are really important in the sense that the consumer continues to buy the final product.
What's your thought, if I just interject for a minute, on solid state battery?
That's a very good question. So solid state exists. It's a technology that exists, and the benefit is that they tend to they have high capacity for holding more charge, and have the ability to provide higher performance than the traditional lithium-ion batteries that are made today. So they're a really important potential future product, but the issue's always been as to how costly they are in comparison to the traditional lithium-ion product. Only just recently, I've been hearing about some auto manufacturers are suggesting they may have cracked that equation, if you will, and are getting the price of solid state further down to the cost of existing lithium-ion batteries. So far as I sit here today, Peter, it's I would have said a few weeks ago that we're still a few years away from solid state becoming the norm in this supply chain, and the investment, nearly all this investment in Europe that you see, these 26 dots, are all in traditional lithium-ion cells. But their technology does vary, because the types of cathodes that you can use, and there's about there's at least half a dozen or more ways in which you can build your battery cell and use the components inside it, which give you different types of charge, capacity, and performance. And you need to pick the one that works for you and your vehicles. But you're right, solid state is something that could come up fast, and would make a huge difference to take up of EVs in the future.
Thank you.
But it's cost. Again, it's cost. If you make a solid state car now, which there are some out there, they're just too expensive to sell at the moment. They wouldn't compete. So that's a very exciting area, very exciting market at the moment, and very interesting. Particularly if you're in supply chain, it's an important area to consider. Talking about the supply chain, I did share this last time, and it's an important point to recognise that if you are producing a zero-emission vehicle, if you are using a lot of fossil fuels in order to make that vehicle, then it spoils the point. And this goes back to why there needs to be that investment in Europe, because at the moment battery cells, and often a lot of battery materials, tend to come from the Far East or from the Americas. So and sometimes they come from different parts of the area. Sorry, you heard it's live. Sorry, that's me. Sorry about that. So yeah, let's just
agree with
right.
part of the slide.
Yeah, classic working from home issue. I think there's two things. Yeah, you're on mute or your dog's barking. Anyway, This is the we've got a highly at the moment it's a fragmented supply chain. If we're getting goods coming from the Far East or America to build battery packs in Europe or the UK, then there's a lot of there's potentially a lot of emissions in the supply chain. And I am seeing OEMs asking a lot of questions about their supply chain, and they want to see emissions coming down from the supply chain as well as in the design of their vehicles. So this is, again, another important area. And so when we think about Europe, we not only think about the fact that you might build battery materials and battery cells and battery packs in Europe, but you've got to start to get the elements out of the ground from European mining sites. And we have a number of sites around Europe which we can use, and they are starting to open up and have an effect on really reducing this, the emissions that we use to actually build these vehicles at the same time. So that's a really positive point. I just wanted to make that point about the supply chain. It's it's a very busy supply chain at the moment, as you can imagine. Finally, it's just, I guess, some points to share with you that I'm seeing. Cost competitiveness is key, always was at VES, I suppose, but even with the incentives and the way things are working with governments and the consistent support, you need to think long term. And if you're making, with a car product lasting 7 years or more as a product, you're building a battery for a car that's going to be in use for at least for 7-8 years. So you've got to build your supply chain in line with all the vehicles that are going to be launched, particularly in the mid-20s. There's a lot of battery vehicles aligned to 25, 26. So if you imagine, all that supply chain has got to be ready to go, and it's got to be at the right price, providing the right performance and the right quality. So it's important that these businesses, as they invest their money, are helped to ensure that they can deliver their products really cost effectively. So sourcing strategies are really important. The benchmarking can take time. The new expertise, in fact, I should have perhaps highlighted that. Finding the right people to deliver a lot of those factories, for example, in Europe, is difficult. There's just by definition, there's a smaller pool of technical people in this area, but the investment's there, it's growing, and Europe in some respects is looking to the Far East and the US to help in the meantime until we really build up our own expertise in these areas, which is very interesting, but it really is a global solution. I'm always on about data, of course I would be. I work for Vendigital, sort of clues in the title, but it is important because it helps you to link across silos. It helps you to think about what your real costs are, what your costs should be, and comparing to what you're actually spending. And it helps you to avoid the silos. And a bit of a mantra for me, I know it's more about the manufacturing rather than the supply chain, but linking design, engineering and procurement are really important, so that you've got the engineering are designing to cost as much as you're designing to cost as much as your engineering and procurement guys are trying to get to the cost of the vehicle. My point being is, if you don't want to be making a vehicle that costs X and you suddenly realize it could cost X minus Y 6 months down the line, and it's going to take you a year or so to implement that. So it's really important to get that up front. If I'm talking to any automotive guys out there, that is an obvious point, but I don't see it. I don't see it as often as perhaps I'd like to get it, and particularly with moving to new products in the market like battery electric vehicles. I think there's a real opportunity to make sure the cost is right, as well as the performance and quality of the vehicle, as you start to move to 50, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of product. And that's me, I think, Peter. I hope that's helpful and interesting.
Really interesting. I think one of the points for me that you brought up was the distance we're traveling for a new supply chain, as I'll call it.
Yeah.
And the fact that supply chain is moving what can only be termed partly as a dangerous good when you look at the battery side.
Yeah.
So whilst we've got to ramp up in terms of building, there's also a challenge, I would have thought, in actually getting skilled and qualified logistics drivers who actually are competent to move that nature of product rather than your typical sort of general logistical goods.
Yes.
Do you see that as a challenge, or?
Well, it goes to place the expertise point. Drivers will need more training. Unfortunately, but it's like moving petrol or hydrogen around. It's, you know, these are dangerous materials that which drive our vehicles. Batteries have their own safety issues. But you're absolutely right. So if you think of the product, it's lithium ion. They can, if I don't know, it's being aware of the safety problems. Yeah, it's like anything. It's the same with petrol, diesel, or hydrogen, or any other fuel. It's being really aware of those safety problems, but they are different to those other energy sources. So the training for drivers or for people moving this equipment around, whether into or out of lorries and around factories, is really important, and particularly inside the factory. Because you're building the fuel within a factory. You're not, if you like, just getting out of the ground and moving it through pipes. This is being built inside a factory, and so human beings are moving around, and you've got a lot of equipment doing a lot of dangerous things, like in any factory. So, but the safety requirements around that are exceptionally important, and in the moving it around, you're absolutely right. Again, you know, there are dangers to this product. You know, they can get very hot. Sometimes they can catch fire. So being aware and being able to handle those extreme situations will need to be part of the training and part of the new expertise we will need in the supply chain going forward.
But I would have also thought that will really change the financial look, because you can't expect a driver who's carrying that sort of goods to be on the same rate as we'll say a Waitrose or Marks and Spencers or whoever you want as a driver, because the job is totally different. So surely there's going to be an added cost in terms of the freight side of moving these goods over what was historic.
Yes, it's you would design a lot of the risk out of it, Peter. So the movement of the goods into and out of a lorry, you should be able to design that in a way that it is virtually, you know, risk-free. But there will just be a natural different training required for that particular product that's being moved around in a lorry or a train or however it's being moved around. Some of the battery materials have similar issues, but again, in moving them around, you can design a lot of the risk out of it. So I wouldn't see it any different to, hazardous material that is moved around in general around the country or countries in Europe or America or China in the normal way. So there might be an element of hazardous material training and therefore a more highly trained driver. But I wouldn't see it being too significant.
Okay.
I think the bigger issue will be whether or not you can get the drivers, actually. It's probably a bigger issue.
Actually do that skilled part of the job for probably not a lot more money than they could it a lot easier. That was sort of, to a certain degree, my point.
Yeah.
Going back to figures and vehicles, and we touched on Volkswagen. The ID3 is third place and has come from nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what vehicle do you see really over the next 3 or 4 years that is likely to be sort of jostling for Tesla's position?
Well, there's a slight. So I think if I look at it in terms of the mark of the brand rather than necessarily the vehicle itself, because they work in different markets. So the Zoe is it tends to be targeted at a slightly different market to say a Tesla 3 or even an ID3. So it's you need to think about your target customer market and how you're going at that. I'm just purely looking at the total numbers at the moment. and that will move and it will jostle for position. I've got some market data on the individual brands as well, if somebody wants to see it. But it will partly depend on that, and that's quite important to take into account. But I think if you think of it in terms of the overall brands, I think the people who are really investing the money in this, you've mentioned Volkswagen, Tesla, and I think the other one which has come up the back straight a little bit over the last few months is Hyundai. They are investing heavily in that area, and they're coming out with some interesting products. So I think the South Koreans are ones to watch, and their products are meeting the demand, consumer demand, as well as just meeting a regulatory requirement. So I put those kind of in the top three. Now, having said that, you've got the likes of Renault. The Renault Zoe is a fantastic little electric car. It's if it's particularly as an entry model. And I see a point where you would have one of those, but you might still keep your FEV or your petrol car on the drive as well, because of the range issue. And that's how I see a lot of this coming out. You're going to have one of the cars on your drive or on the road. So it's developing, but I'd say those guys. I mean the French, and with Stellantis, the merger that created Stellantis recently, the number of new models coming onto the market is going to get very interesting. But at the moment, it seems to be those three which are sort of getting quite exciting to me, or those three or four which are exciting.
Do you think when you look at achieving the level of electric vehicle, obviously the biggest portion of the market are the vehicles in probably the Hyundai and the Renault Zoe market, because we've talked about the Taycan and we've talked about the high-end Teslas. But that middle market is surely where the bulk of the achievement of getting needs to be concentrated on for the volume.
Yes. Yeah. I think it's actually it's across the entire. It needs to happen from the point of view of the volume and creating viable global businesses. Because even though I think the pandemic has shown that if you get your volume right with your customer markets, then you can make less cars and still make money. But volume is still important. Levels of volume. But I said to someone yesterday, I hadn't given an awful lot of thought, but you reminded me of this again. Is it's a bit like changing your vinyls for CDs. This is, and it's that was consumer led in a way. It was. Arguably, to those who are wedded to vinyl, please forgive me. But in those days when we moved over, it created that digital sound, that arguably better sound more easily, more cost effectively, and so on. And then you get this, and then you've got this nice product that you're using, which is different and appeals to a younger audience and everything else. And it's this, and then you had DVDs coming in as well, and there was other things being, then we had streaming, as it were. So this is about those vehicles need to replace what we are doing, and need to replace the existing car park over time. So, and with the way regulations going, not just in Europe but also in the Far East, it will happen. Yeah.
Do you think it's away from really the stats and everything that you've pulled in, but how big a push do you feel we need to do more on infrastructure?
Oh, that's yeah. So there's a number of schools of thought around that, because it's not just the infrastructure; it's actually whether or not we can produce the right amount of electricity for the vehicles as well to supply the infrastructure that then charges your vehicles. More needs to be done, but I'm saying that the investment is going into it, and it seems to be, when everyone looks at it, it's a bit behind what we need, but then it seems to catches up.
Yeah.
The big difference, in my view, between an internal combustion engine vehicle and the battery electric vehicle is you can charge at home. So I come back to the point is that can you get enough electricity to supply your new car park for your particular country? And I know that some people have only got streets to park on, they don't have drives, but in the UK, for example, at least 40%, it's about 45% of homes have drives. So it's still a huge part of the market. You've got a completely different, you don't have to move your car out to go and fill it up before you go to work or go on your long journey. You can do it at home. So I think that needs to be incorporated into the discussion around infrastructure, because you can't do that with internal combustion engines. So there needs to be more. And it also needs to be renewable, Peter. So and certainly in the UK, and I'm afraid I can only really speak for the UK, but it is going on in Western Europe as well. But the amount of investment in wind farms and offshore wind farms should supply the right amount of electricity for the vehicles that are coming onto the market over the next decade. It's whether or not then the infrastructure, because you need to change the motorway of the structure, if you like, as well as the A and B roads of the structure in order to deliver that to your vehicles. But again, I say you can charge at home. So if you've got your charging at home right, 85% of all journeys are less than 15 miles. So if the consumer might need to do a little bit more planning, and that arguably is a big problem because it could arguably be not as convenient. However, I think that for that little bit of amount of planning, it will be easily done, and people will start to move over. The technology in these battery electric vehicles, if you take a Tesla, for example, is so different to existing internal combustion engines. It's very attractive to the younger generation and to new generations coming through. So there is an element of the product just being more interesting or better for a particular market as well. So, and that will drive the infrastructure requirement.
Okay. Thanks, Justin. We are sort of relatively close to time, and if anyone has any questions that they really wanted to raise with Justin, you can do that as well online afterwards directly into his member profile. I know there's always a hesitancy of questions sometimes from the floor, which we used to notice actually at an in-person event as well, didn't we? You'd get a handful of people, the same people who asked all the questions, and the bulk of people waited for the coffee machine. There is one in there, so whether that sparked it or whether or not it didn't. Can you see the one in from Richard?
Yeah. That's a good question, because I haven't talked about it much, but commercial vehicles is it's a question about commercial vehicles and any insights on the evolution of vans to cover the last mile in the distribution of goods in cities. The commercial vehicle is a really important market to the global manufacturers, because the vehicles, the demand for those vehicles has increased dramatically during the pandemic because of all the demand for deliveries, direct to home, and increased deliveries to the likes of grocers and so on. But the deliveries in general, and it was already increasing before the pandemic quite significantly because of the demand for deliveries anyway, the likes of Amazon and so on. So that's really important to note in the first place. So I think the internal combustion version of that vehicle still has a life. But going back to the regulation point, not only are countries setting new regulation, but individual cities are setting regulation. And London has been leading the way in that. In some respects, Birmingham is doing some things recently, but and then the cities in China have been saying they want zero emissions in their centres for some time. But if you take that and the regulation, for example, in London, there are certain streets in London you just can't drive unless you have a battery electric vehicle, unless you want to pay a pretty hefty fine, relates a lot to commercial vehicles. So if you think about the one we all know and love, the transit, for example, as that starts to deliver more in London in the future, it will need to have battery versions of it, and there are more and more battery versions coming out. Ford recently announced a pure battery version. They've got a plug-in hybrid that they've just launched, and that's in the market now. They've announced a battery electric version for future, and most of the commercial vehicle manufacturers have done similar recently. So I see those vehicles much more on the ground, and in some respects they could move much more quicker than passenger vehicles, because if the regulation in the city is such that you can't drive on the roads without battery electric vehicles, then you will need to move your logistics operations or your delivery operations will need to move over to battery electric vehicle very quickly.
Thank you. We're actually over, so thanks very much, Justin. Keep safe. We look forward to seeing you again, hopefully soon a little bit more in person.
Face to face, yeah. Okay.
We'll probably be going out later, you know, with photograph frames when we introduce ourselves to people. We'll just look through it, so we feel familiar. But nice to speak to you, and thanks very much. For everyone who's participated, thank you. And for the ones of you who will be appearing or watching on our on-demand section, this is a session that you shouldn't have missed. Take care. Thanks, Justin.
Good luck, everyone. Cheers, then. Bye-bye.
Hi, it's Peter again, and thank you for watching the session. Don't forget you can connect with all members within the EV community. Send messages to each other and start to build relationships for the future. Also, take a look at our supplier showrooms. Our partners have got lots of products and services that they have to offer, which again could be of benefit to you. Make the most of the opportunity, and thank you again for joining us.